But first, the Chancellor, George Osborne, says the SNP are tying themselves in knots over plans to retain the pound in the event of a yes vote for independence. In an article published on the Treasury website, Mr Osborne and the Financial Secretary to the Treasury, Danny Alexander, insist the Scottish Government's proposal doesn't add up. But the Scottish Government says keeping the pound is a common-sense position supported by the facts. Well, let's speak now to the former Labour Chancellor and Chairman of the Better Together campaign, Alistair Darling, and also to the SNP's Westminster Treasury spokesman, Stewart Hosie MP. Good morning to both of you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Let's look at this issue of the Scottish banknotes. It's making a lot of the headlines this morning. The UK government are being accused of scaremongering over the potential loss of Scottish banknotes. Alistair Darling, is that likely to happen?
Well, it's one of a number of issues that would need to be looked at. But I think my main objection to a currency union is because of the straitjacket that it would place Scotland in. And if you believe that independence is the way to get out of all the constraints that you can possibly imagine, it doesn't add up.
What sort of straitjacket would it place Scotland in?
Let me explain exactly what a currency union is. And you don't have to imagine this. Just look at what is going on in the Eurozone at the present time. What it means is that both sides have to agree budgets, they have to agree how much can be spent, how much can be taxed, how much can be borrowed, and that means you've instead of having a democratic say in a parliament that you've elected as to what your budget is, it then has to be negotiated by officials. This is what is happening in the Eurozone at the moment, and you can see the difficulties that countries are getting into.
But we're talking about several countries and several different types and sizes of economies in the Eurozone, to be fair.
And you see, the currency union we'd be talking about here is one where 90% of the economy was in one part of the currency union, only 10% in another. At least in the Eurozone there are 17 member states. But you can see at the moment, with a currency union, the problem is somebody tells you what your budget should be, they control your tax and spending, and the idea that, as Nicola Sturgeon was saying last week, with a currency union, you could go out and spend as much as you want on benefits or on this, that and the next thing, it is nonsense. And it seems to me a currency union is second best, and it's not just me saying that. If you look at Professor John Kay, one of Alex Salmond's advisors, who's highly rated throughout the world, he says that he doubts whether a currency union could possibly get you anything that proponents of independence would want, which is why more and more people, including a lot of nationalists, are looking at a separate Scottish currency, which I think would be absolutely disastrous because of the additional costs that would impose on industry trying to export south of the border and the nuisance having to change your money every time you went south or came north. But I really think that as far as a currency union is concerned, it is absolute nonsense. It's second best, and the irony is, as we can see in Europe, a currency union takes you back to an economic union and then to a political union.
Okay, well,
Why
let me
go through all of this simply to end up where you started from?
Let me ask Stewart Hosie then about whether or not, in his view, as you suggest there, a currency union with the UK would tie Scotland's hands economically.
Well, let's just go through what Alistair said, because I have to say this scaremongering is getting more hysterical by the day. We don't have our tax set by a foreign country when we're independent. We'll work to agreed deficit and debt targets, which is extremely sensible, and that's the sort of thing any country should do anyway.
But these will be agreed in close negotiation with the UK.
Well, they have to be, but that's a sensible thing to do in any currency union. You don't want your deficit and debt to spiral out of control the way it did under Labour. Now, the second argument he said is we're tying ourselves in knots. Far from it. The Fiscal Commission, the Independent Fiscal Commission, has laid out a blueprint for precisely how a currency union would work. In terms of the euro, I know that the unionist parties want to pretend we'll be like Greece and Germany. We won't. The reason Greece failed was because its productivity was barely a third of that of Germany. Scotland and the rest of the UK's productivity is nigh on identical. And this stuff that we hear, again, this scaremongering that, you know, a currency union would lead to fiscal union. If you look at what happened between Belgium and Luxembourg, they had a currency union for 80 years. It didn't even lead to tax harmonisation. Their tax rates were different. They were able to compete with each other while sharing a currency. And, you know, I know the unionists want to make this sound dreadfully difficult all the time, but I think instead of the hysteria, they should sit down, have proper discussions, proper negotiations, and work out how this can work because it's in everybody's best interests, Scotland and the rest of the UK, that it does work.
Alistair Darling, what about that example of a currency union which Stewart Hosie cited there? Also, how does the Isle of Man work? I mean, it's essentially a separate country, but it has a currency union.
Yeah, well, I don't think the Isle of Man and Scotland don't bear comparison. And the Scottish economy is quite sophisticated. You know, we have quite a large financial services sector, which depends to a very large extent on its untrammelled access to the rest of the UK and the fact that it's regulated by a common regulator and so on. So I don't think they're comparable. Equally, the Belgium-Luxembourg Union was not a happy affair, and of course it came to an end when the euro was set up. Look, I'm just simply pointing out the practical consequences of having a currency union. You move from a situation where at the moment the pound sterling is the currency of the United Kingdom. If you vote to leave the UK, you've left 90% of that economy. You've actually left the bank that prints the notes in the first place in another economy. Therefore, you seek to come into a currency union. There will be terms and conditions. Now, Stuart's a reasonable chap, I know that. He doesn't mind those terms and conditions, but he knows pretty well there's an awful lot of people who support independence who believe that only if we had independence we could spend more on benefits, we could spend more on just about everything else under the sun. You can't do that in a currency union. And when he says, well, don't compare us with the Eurozone is a real example of what is happening now, where they are talking about moving from an economic union to slowly more and more political union. That is where a currency union takes you. It takes you back to political union. And I have to ask, therefore, why on earth would you vote for independence if what you're actually doing is going into a situation where firstly you'd have a currency union, a straitjacket on what you can do, knowing full well it's going to take you back into closer integration.
So what is your concern then? Is it that Scotland couldn't pull its weight if it was independent but still within a currency union?
I have never argued that Scotland couldn't go it alone. I think we'd be very heavily and over-dependent on North Sea oil, where we know the price goes up and down. It's not going to run out tomorrow.
It's still a resource, nonetheless, an economic resource.
It's not going to run out tomorrow, but it's not going to go on forever. But you are very heavily dependent on 20% of your tax revenues coming from one source, and we know that it's gone. Prices do go up and down, and so you're very exposed if there was a shock to the system with a sudden drop in oil price, for example. But you know the whole fallacy of this idea of independence, that somehow Scotland would be better off if it broke away from the rest of the UK, it simply does not stack up with a currency union, and that's why you're seeing now more and more nationalists, and including, as I said, Professor John Kay, who is, a very distinguished advisor, saying, actually, if that's what you want, you'd be better with a separate currency altogether. Now, I think that brings a whole host of other problems along, but perhaps this whole thing illustrates that the point is that at the moment we have a UK economy, we have £1 sterling, we have a potential there that could be hugely beneficial to Scotland, because the two economies are not actually that divergent. Instead of that, you've got all the cost, all the disruption, all the trauma of setting up a currency union. And as I say,
well, that sounds like there might not be as many problems as you're suggesting. The two economies are actually very similar. But let me bring Stewart Hosie in.
For breaking apart, then, is it? It rather suggests that the UK.
Well,
has
that depends on what voters in Scotland want to do democratically with their future. Stewart Hosie, let me ask you about the currency union and Scottish banknotes in particular. I mean, John Swinney is suggesting that this would be underpinned by the 2009 Banking Act, that Scottish notes could remain in place and not threatened, as this report is likely to say. Is that for certain? Legally, would that be the case?
Well, I have to say, this is turning out to be my favourite anti-independence scare story of the day. Every single Scottish note in circulation is fully covered by a Bank of England note or coins or other assets held by the Bank of England, which guarantees its value. That wouldn't change under a currency union. But frankly, this is mere bagatelle compared to the stuff Alistair was going on about. He spoke about straitjacket. I think the austerity programme of the UK government is a straitjacket. He makes the point that sterling would no longer
be stuck with it under the new
Alistair,
system.
I didn't interrupt you, so please. You make the point that sterling wouldn't be our currency. Of course it would. The only difference, Alistair, with independence and a currency union is that while an independent central bank imposes monetary discipline on both countries, and both countries would then have full fiscal power, At the moment, only George Osborne has control of the fiscal levers that affect Scotland. How much better it would be, so we could make the right choices for Scotland, for an independent Scotland to have the same power over its tax and spend that the UK currently does over taxation in Scotland, while maintaining a currency union so that the market, the trade between Scotland and the rest of the UK, can continue as it ought to.
OK, gentlemen, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for speaking to us this morning. That was Stewart Hosie MP, the SNP's Westminster Treasury spokesman, and we also heard from Alistair Darling, the chairman of the Better Together campaign.